Please be seated. Good morning. Thanks for welcoming me back from a vacation. We were at a wedding actually last weekend in New Hampshire. My younger cousin, was getting married, and Justice of the Peace did it. So it was nice to sit out in the crowd and not have to worry about being on duty. And afterwards, really the party of the wedding, as it probably was in Cana, was the food and stuff afterwards, this big dinner. And we realized that it had rained the night before in this backyard where the wedding was, and they put out these chairs with the legs that go right into the ground. So when we sat down, depending on how much you weighed, you sunk into the earth. And somebody said, "Man, it's like they want to keep us here. It's like they want to root us here." And I said, "Yeah, I think that's what they're trying for." So I think when you have good meals, you don't want to get up. You don't want them to end. Unfortunately, today we come to the end of the 6th chapter of John, this wonderful meal passage. And what Jesus does here in this passage is he interprets the entirety of the chapter. He interprets the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, and he interprets essentially what we do every week here at the Eucharist. He shows us what's happening and kind of what's important. And I think the way he interprets this is through relationship. So it's a really good idea to start with something like a wedding where you get a bunch of people together around a meal. But it might not have been a wedding. Think about what the best meal that you had this summer was. Think about what the best meal that you had was. Maybe it was a lobster dinner with your family, with just a few people. Maybe it was a special dinner with your wife or partner at that Italian place up in Little Italy that you met at or something. Maybe it was something at Nationals Park. And you don't remember the outcome of the game, but you remember that half smoke, right? Whatever it is, it's important to realize that when Jesus talks about the spirit and the flesh, right, he says the flesh is useless. I think what he's trying to get at here is that without the spiritual component of a meal, it's not really a meal. And think about it, when is a meal more than a meal? It's when you're around people that you care about. It's around important events in your life. You still remember those meals growing up where maybe it was the first dinner party that you were invited to with your parents that you could actually go to and sit at the big table. Maybe it was a special Christmas meal where a long-lost relative had flown in from far away and you hadn't seen him in forever. Maybe you haven't seen him since, but you still remember that meal. You probably don't remember the Yorkshire pudding. You probably don't remember what you had for dessert, but you remember who was sitting at the table. And I think that's what Jesus is pointing to here. He's saying the meal, the physical stuff, isn't as important as the spiritual stuff. And I think it's true up here too. The stuff that we see, the bread, the wine, the crumbs, the spills, the purificators, the winks, the fidgety children, it's not as important as the spiritual stuff that's going on up here unseen. And maybe you felt that. Maybe you felt it when you've come up here at this table and you've knelt down next to somebody you really, really love. And you just feel a deeper connection with them. You feel like you're rooted in your souls with that person. Or maybe even better. Maybe you come up here and you kneel and you look up across the rail at somebody with whom you've had a bitter disagreement. Maybe you're kneeling next to somebody who has fought you tooth and nail, maybe in church, maybe outside of church. Maybe that person doesn't believe what you hold to be true, and yet you're here sharing a meal, breaking bread, and drinking from a common cup. I mean, that's the stuff that we don't see that binds this table together, I think. And I think it has to do with stuff that we can't really see, which is why I thought of John Irving's book. Some of you may have read it, A Prayer for Owen Meany. If you've read that book, you remember this passage. When it was so dark at the St. Michael's playground that we couldn't see the basket. We couldn't see Mary Magdalene either, the statue. What Owen liked best was to practice until we lost the statue in the darkness. Then he would stand under the basket with me and say, "Can you see her?" "Not anymore," I'd say. You can't see her, but you know she's still there, right? He would say. Of course she's still there, I'd say. You're sure, he'd ask me. Of course I'm sure, he'd say. But you can't see her, he'd say very teasingly. How do you know she's still there if you can't actually see her? You have no doubt she's there, he nagged at me. Of course I have no doubt, I said. But you can't see her. You could be wrong, he said. I'm not wrong. She's there. I know she's there, I yelled at him. You absolutely know she's there even though you can't see her, he asked me. Yes, I screamed. Well, now you know how I feel about God, said Owen Meany. I can't see him, but I absolutely know he is there. A lot of us want to put faith in that box. A lot of us want to say that that's what faith is. Faith is believing in things that you can't see, believing in things that don't make sense. Faith is hope in the things that are not yet seen, Paul says. Faith might be the faith that a franchise might finally win a Super Bowl. Faith that your job will work out, your relationship will improve. You have faith in something that hasn't been seen yet. But I think Jesus' offer of telling people, what if you see this? What if you have physical proof? I think it cuts a little deeper. Because in John's gospel, listen, faith, belief, and knowledge, all three of those words are used interchangeably. We would never do that. In this post-Enlightenment age, we would never use those terms interchangeably. There are things that you believe, there are things that you have faith in, and there are things that you know. You know that the pavement is wet outside because you've heard the rain. You've seen the rain. Maybe you've even felt the rain. You don't need to have faith in it. You don't need to believe it because you know it to be true. That's a difference that our post-Enlightenment brains have made. For John, he doesn't make that difference because he's using the word knowledge in a Hebrew sense to a Greek audience. In the Hebrew Bible, when the word knowledge is used, it talks about a relationship. It talks about an intimate, maybe even sexual relationship, the knowledge of someone. And when the prophet Hosea chides his people for a lack of knowledge, he's not telling them, look, you didn't go to Sunday school. You don't know the books of the Bible. You don't know the doctrines of the church. You don't know how to say the creed the right way. You don't know when to kneel and when to stand up. You don't have the knowledge that is necessary to follow God. That's not what Hosea meant. He said, your people have lost their connection with God. They've lost that relationship, that soul connection with their Maker. And without that, they are lost. Without that, we are lost. So the idea is that belief and faith aren't things that we have to achieve or attain, but rather they're things that live within us, that ebb and flow, that come and go as we do. One guy really listened to a lot, he once said, you have your faith and you have your belief, and it's on a spectrum. And if we want to say that God requires a certain amount of faith or belief, if that makes you sleep at night, go ahead and believe that. God will always give you the faith that you need, whatever amount. If you can only get up this high, God will finish the rest. And if you're up here somewhere, God's got a little bit more to fill in. But the idea is that faith or belief or knowledge should not keep you from this table. As a matter of fact, that's one of the reasons we come here to this table. We come to explore our faith, to nurture our faith, to grow it, to grow in relationship with God, to know God more, to become intimate with God. Which is why, I sometimes get a little frustrated with people who get, a little weird about the flesh and blood language. I understand it's a little gruesome. Hey, I saw Silence of the Lambs 2 last night. But you have to understand that Jesus is using a metaphor here. He's saying, how can somebody know me so intimately And maybe it's a little awkward, but that's what he reached for. That's how much he wants to know us. So, the difficulty in this lesson that drove people away, what was it? Was it the flesh and blood language? Was it the fact that Jesus said, some people are going to believe and some people aren't going to believe? Some people are going to go away from me because they don't believe. Was that what was so difficult? Ask yourself, what keeps you from this table? What are the stumbling blocks that you reach when you're walking up here? What are the things that you have to step over? Is it something in yourself? Is it a yearning that hasn't been met? Is it a desire to taste everything that's up here, but not having the taste buds to do it? What is it that keeps us from the table? What God wants us to see, and I think what Jesus is hinting at, is that there's a relationship to be had up here. There's a relationship to be eaten, to be drank, to be consumed in bread, in wine. Mostly, it's a relationship with each other. And that's why we try to broaden this table as much as we can. We try to stretch this table out and this rail out as much as we can. Because the more people that we're in a relationship with, the more God is present. The more God is present in our lives. So, in this interpretation of the Eucharist, Jesus is essentially saying, don't get caught up on the bread and the wine being flesh and blood. Don't get caught up on the trappings and limitations of your faith. Some days I believe more than others. Some days I come in here and I'm almost on empty. You know who brings me up? You. You do. There are those of you who come today on empty. You're running on fumes. And you come up here to the filling station and you're hoping to be fed. You're hoping to be nourished. The bread and the wine will nourish you. But it will nourish you more if there is a connection with each other and a connection with God. I think that's what we're trying to achieve here at St. Margaret's in this community. I think we're trying to achieve a greater, deeper connection with God and therefore with one another. We do that through serving. We do that through forgiving. And we do that through eating together at this wonderful table. Amen.